stop scrolling right now. Because what I'm about to tell you will change the way you look at every helpful stranger, every friendly librarian, every quiet neighbor who minds their own business. His name was Thomas Werner Erickson. 63 confirmed victims. 23 years of killing. And you've never heard of him. Why? Because he was smarter than Bundy, more patient than BTK, more invisible than the Zodiac. He killed entire families, mothers, fathers, children, and made it look like accidents. He walked past police investigations 17 times without raising a single red flag. He volunteered at youth centers while bodies piled up in his wake. And I was the detective who caught him. But here's what will terrify you. We only caught him because he wanted us to. Because after 23 years, he was tired of working in silence. He wanted recognition. How many others are out there right now who aren't tired yet? I'm Detective Sarah Holloway, and if you care about justice, if you believe the forgotten deserve to be remembered, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. Share this video. Because Thomas Werner Erickson killed 63 people, and the world barely noticed. Don't let that happen again. Don't let them be forgotten. This is their story. This is his story. And this is how we brought a monster into the light. I need you to understand something about evil. It doesn't announce itself with horror movie music or obvious warning signs. It doesn't wear a mask or lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes evil shows up in a cardigan and reading glasses, recommending the perfect mystery novel for your weekend. That's what made Thomas Werner Erickson so dangerous. And that's why, even after everything we discovered, even after 63 confirmed victims, most people still don't know his name. It started for me on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. I'd been with the Portland Police Department's Major Crimes Unit for 11 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Domestics gone wrong, gang violence, crimes of passion and crimes of desperation. But when Captain Morrison called me into his office that morning, I could see something different in his eyes. Something that looked almost like fear. "We have a problem," he said, sliding a file across his desk. A big one. Inside were photographs of 3 women, different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the city. But they shared one thing. They were all dead. And they'd all died in ways that defied easy explanation. No obvious cause of death. No signs of struggle. No evidence of sexual assault or robbery. Just 3 women who'd gone to sleep and never woken up, found by loved ones who thought they were napping. "Natural causes?" I asked. Morrison shook his head. Medical examiner found puncture marks, tiny ones, almost invisible, behind the left ear, just at the hairline. Someone injected them with something that metabolizes quickly and leaves almost no trace. Almost? She found it in the 3rd victim, microscopic amounts, a compound she'd never seen before. A modified neurotoxin derived from cone snail venom, combined with something synthetic. Whoever made this knows chemistry. Advanced chemistry. I studied the photographs again. Jennifer Holloway, 34, a high school teacher. Maria Santos, 41, a nurse. Rebecca Chen, 29, a software developer. Connection between the victims? None that we can find. Different social circles, different neighborhoods, different everything. It's like they were chosen at random. But I knew better than Morrison did that nothing is ever truly random. Randomness is just a pattern we haven't recognized yet. Over the next 3 weeks, I dove into those 3 cases like a woman possessed. I interviewed families, friends, co-workers. I traced their movements in the weeks before their deaths. I looked for the invisible thread that connected them because I knew it had to be there. And then victim number 4 appeared. Her name was Linda Mercer, 56 years old, a librarian at the downtown branch. Same method, same invisible puncture mark, same phantom toxin that was already breaking down in her system by the time we found her. That's when I noticed something. Something small. Something that everyone else had missed. Each victim had checked out books from the library in the week before they died. Not just any library, the downtown branch where Linda Mercer worked. And not just any books. Each woman had checked out a book on psychology, true crime, or forensic science. I remember standing in that library surrounded by thousands of volumes and feeling the weight of understanding settle over me like a heavy coat. This wasn't random. This was selection. Someone was watching these women, studying them, choosing them based on what they read. Someone who worked there. Someone who had access to the checkout records. Someone who could see what books people borrowed and make assumptions about who they were, what interested them, what kept them up at night. I started pulling employee records that same day. 12 people worked at that branch, including Linda Mercer herself. 11 suspects, ranging from the 60-year-old head librarian to a 19-year-old college student who shelved books part-time. But none of them raised immediate red flags. No criminal records, no suspicious behavior, no obvious signs of the monster I was hunting. That's when I learned the first crucial lesson about Thomas Werner Erickson. He was extraordinarily good at appearing normal, better than normal. He appeared kind. I started surveillance on all 11 employees, rotating teams to watch them during off hours. For 2 weeks, we saw nothing. Just ordinary people living ordinary lives, going to work, going home, watching television, walking dogs. And then on a Friday night in October, I saw him. Thomas Werner Erickson, 47 years old, had worked at the downtown library for 9 years. He was the senior reference librarian, the person patrons went to when they needed help finding obscure information. He was patient, knowledgeable, and by all accounts, genuinely helpful. He had kind eyes and a gentle voice. Parents trusted him around their children. Elderly patrons asked for him by name. And on that Friday night, I watched him prepare to kill again. The night I first saw Thomas Werner Erickson for who he truly was, it was raining. One of those cold October rains that Portland does so well. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you want to be anywhere but outside. I was parked 3 blocks from his apartment in an unmarked sedan, coffee going cold in the cup holder. My partner Danny asleep in the passenger seat, with his head against the window. It was 2:17 in the morning when Erickson's lights went on. I elbowed Danny awake. Movement! We watched as a figure emerged from the apartment building. Erickson wore a dark raincoat and carried what looked like a small backpack. Nothing inherently suspicious except for the time and the way he moved. Purposeful. Deliberate, like a man with somewhere specific to be. Follow him? Danny asked. At a distance. We tailed him through empty streets, staying far enough back that our headlights wouldn't spook him. He drove carefully, obeying every traffic law, using his turn signals even when there was no other car in sight. This was a man who understood that it's the small infractions that get you caught. He parked in a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize. We watched from the corner as he got out, shouldered his backpack, and walked up to a small craftsman-style house with blue shutters. A light was on in what looked like a bedroom window. Run the address, I whispered. Danny pulled it up on his laptop. Registered to a Melissa Thorne, age 38, works as a paralegal downtown. Check library records. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Bingo, checked out Mindhunter and The Stranger Beside Me last Wednesday. My heart started hammering. We need backup, now. But even as Danny reached for the radio, I saw Erickson do something that made my blood freeze. He didn't go to the front door. He didn't knock or ring the bell. Instead, he walked around to the side of the house, into the shadows where the street light didn't reach, and simply stood there, waiting. Waiting for what? For the light to go out, for his victim to fall asleep? I couldn't wait to find out. Call it in, I told Danny, already opening my door. I'm going in. Sarah, wait for backup. But I was already moving, weapon drawn, staying low and fast across the wet street. I could hear Danny behind me, cursing under his breath as he followed. We approached from opposite sides, using cars and bushes for cover. I reached the side of the house just as Erickson was pulling something from his backpack. In the dim light, bleeding from the bedroom window, I could see it clearly. A small case, the kind a diabetic might use to carry insulin. But inside wasn't insulin. Inside was death. Police! Freeze! He did freeze, but not the way guilty people usually do. There was no panic in his body language, no sudden movement or attempt to flee. He simply stopped, turned slowly, and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't fear or anger or even surprise. It was disappointment. Detective, he said quietly, his voice as calm as if we were meeting in the library. I wish you hadn't come tonight. Put down the bag. Hands where I can see them. He complied, setting the backpack gently on the ground and raising his hands. You don't understand what you're interrupting. I understand perfectly. Step away from the bag. Danny was at my side now, radio in hand, calling in our location. In the distance, I could hear sirens beginning to wail. Backup was coming. Erickson tilted his head slightly, studying me with unsettling focus. Do you know why I chose them, Detective? The women? You can tell me downtown. They were all the same, every one of them. They read about monsters because they wanted to understand evil. They wanted to peek behind the curtain, to see what makes people like me tick. They were curious about darkness. He smiled then, and it was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen. I simply gave them a closer look than they bargained for. On the ground. Now. He knelt slowly, hands still raised. You think you've stopped something tonight? You think you've saved that woman sleeping in there, blissfully unaware of how close she came. But Detective Holloway, you've only stopped tonight. You haven't stopped what's already happened. What does that mean? His smile widened. How many victims do you think I have? 4 that we know of. 4. He laughed softly. You brilliant, foolish woman. I've been doing this for 23 years. 4 is just what you've found. The backup units arrived then, flooding the street with red and blue light. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They cuffed Erickson and pulled him to his feet, but his eyes never left mine. I'll tell you everything, he said as they led him away, every name, every face, every technique. Because I want you to know, Detective, I want you to understand exactly what walked among you all this time. We searched his apartment that night. What we found made 4 victims seem almost merciful by comparison. He kept journals. 17 of them, each one dedicated to a different victim. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, detailed notes about their habits and routines. He'd watched some of them for months before he struck. One woman he'd observed for nearly a year. But it was what we found in his basement that truly revealed the depth of his depravity. A laboratory, actual chemistry equipment, beakers, burners, a centrifuge, racks of chemicals with names I couldn't pronounce. This was where he'd manufactured his poison, experimenting and refining it until he'd created something almost undetectable. And on a shelf above his workbench, in a simple wooden box, were 17 driver's licenses, trophies, each one belonging to a woman he'd killed, each one a life he'd stolen, each one a family he'd destroyed. I stood in that basement, surrounded by the evidence of systematic evil, and I realized something that would haunt me for years. We'd been looking for a serial killer, but we'd found something far worse. Because the journals didn't just document his primary victims. They documented what came after. The families, the husbands and children and parents who died in the months following the original murders, deaths that had been ruled accidents or natural causes or unexplained tragedies, deaths that Thomas Werner Erickson had orchestrated with the same methodical precision he'd used on his primary targets. He wasn't just killing women. He was killing entire bloodlines, erasing whole families from existence. And he'd been doing it for more than 2 decades. The interrogation room smelled like old coffee and fear. I'd sat in this room hundreds of times, across from hundreds of suspects, but I'd never felt quite like this. Thomas Werner Erickson sat with perfect posture, hands folded on the table, looking for all the world like a professor about to give a lecture. In a way, I suppose he was. 17, I said, sliding the journals across the table. You killed 17 people. 17 that I completed, he corrected. There were 3 others I selected but never followed through with. One moved away, one changed her reading habits, started checking out romance novels instead. And one, he paused, something almost like regret crossing his face. One reminded me of my sister. You have a sister? Had. Catherine. She died when we were children. Meningitis. He touched one of the journals gently, reverently. She used to read to me. Mystery stories, mostly. She loved trying to figure out who the killer was before the detective did. Is that what this is about, your sister? No, detective, this is about curiosity. He leaned forward slightly. Do you know what it's like to be truly curious about something? Not just interested, but consumed by the need to understand? I wanted to know what happens in that moment. The moment when the mind realizes the body is shutting down, but before unconsciousness takes over. That window, it's perhaps 5 to 7 seconds with the compound I developed, where they know something is wrong but can't quite grasp what. I wanted to see it, to document it. I felt bile rise in my throat. They were people. They had families, friends, lives. They were subjects, he interrupted. And yes, I understand that makes me a monster in your eyes. But I want you to understand something, Detective Holloway. I'm not insane. I'm not hearing voices or responding to childhood trauma beyond the normal scope. I simply found something that fascinated me more than social convention could constrain. Over the next 6 hours, he told me everything, every victim, every method, every moment. He spoke about murder the way a wine enthusiast might discuss vintages, with appreciation, with nuance, with genuine passion. His first victim was in 1996 in a different city, under a different name. He'd been Thomas Werner then before he added Erickson, his mother's maiden name, to create a new identity. That first kill was imperfect, he explained. Too much toxin. The victim had seizures before dying, which attracted medical attention and nearly exposed him. I learned from that, he said. I always learned. Each subject taught me something new about dosage, about timing, about the importance of selecting victims whose deaths wouldn't trigger extensive investigation. That's why you chose women who lived alone, I realized. Why you picked people who might not be found for hours or even days after death. Partial credit, detective. But it was more than that. I chose women who were curious about death themselves, who read about it, studied it, thought about it. There's a symmetry there, don't you think? They wanted to understand darkness, and I facilitated that understanding in the most direct way possible. You're insane. No, I'm honest. Most people are fascinated by death, by violence, by the transgressive. They just don't have the courage to admit it. Why do you think true crime is so popular? Why do you think people slow down to look at car accidents? He gestured at me. Why do you think you became a homicide detective, Sarah? The use of my first name felt like a violation. Don't compare me to you. I'm not. You channel your curiosity into justice. I channeled mine into something else. We're both seeking understanding. We've simply chosen different methods. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to wipe that calm, rational expression off his face. But I couldn't, because he was giving me what I needed. A full confession. Details that would seal his conviction. Closure for 17 families. Except it wasn't 17 families. It was so much more than that. Why? I asked finally. Why tell me all this? Why not demand a lawyer and stay silent? He was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something genuine in his expression. Something that might have been loneliness. Because, he said softly, for 23 years, I've done the most important work of my life, and I've had to keep it completely secret. Do you know what that's like? To achieve something you consider profound and never be able to share it? You're a detective, Sarah. You solve puzzles. You find patterns. I thought you might understand, even if you can't condone. I don't understand. I never will. Perhaps not. He leaned back in his chair. But you'll remember me. Long after I'm gone, you'll think about this conversation, about what I said, about what I did. And in those quiet moments, you'll wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's a part of you that understands the curiosity, not the killing, but the wondering. The door opened then, and my captain stuck his head in. Sarah, word. I left Erickson sitting there, still calm, still composed. In the hallway, Captain Morrison looked grim. We've got a problem, he said. His lawyer just arrived, and you're not going to believe who it is. Who? Catherine Erickson. I stared at him. His sister? The one who died? Apparently not. She's very much alive and very much planning to mount an insanity defense. Says she's been treating her brother for delusional disorder for 15 years and has documentation to prove it. My mind reeled. He'd lied. Thomas Werner Erickson, who'd spent 6 hours giving me what seemed like brutally honest confession, had lied about something as basic as whether his sister was alive or dead, which meant I couldn't trust anything else he'd told me. I walked back into the interrogation room without waiting for Morrison's permission. Erickson looked up at me with that same unsettling calm. Your sister is alive? I said. Yes. You lied to me. I told you what you needed to hear to understand my psychology. Catherine's death was formative for me, even if it only happened in my mind. The grief shaped who I became. Nothing you've said is true, is it? This whole confession, it's just another game. On the contrary, Detective, everything I've told you about the murders is absolutely true. I simply embellished my motivations to make them more narratively satisfying. You wanted to understand the monster. I gave you a monster you could comprehend, one with childhood trauma and psychological scars. The truth is much simpler and much more disturbing. What's the truth? He smiled. I killed them because I wanted to, because I could, because it interested me. There's no deeper meaning, no tragic backstory that explains everything. I'm not broken, I'm not damaged. I simply don't value human life the way you do. And I never have. That was when I understood the real horror of Thomas Werner Erickson. He wasn't a monster created by circumstance or illness or trauma. He was a monster by choice, by preference. And there was nothing more terrifying than that. Catherine Erickson was nothing like her brother. Where Thomas was calm and measured, she was fierce and immediate. She strode into the police station like she owned it, a leather briefcase in one hand and fury radiating from every pore. I'm representing my brother, she announced, and this interrogation is over. Now. I met her in the hallway outside the interrogation room. Up close, I could see the family resemblance, the same sharp cheekbones, the same intense eyes. But where Thomas's gaze was cold and analytical, hers burned with something I couldn't quite identify. Protection? Desperation? Guilt? Your brother just confessed to 17 murders, I told her. My brother is severely mentally ill and has been for most of his adult life. Any confession he gave was made while in the grips of a delusional state and is therefore inadmissible. He was perfectly lucid, detailed, specific. Schizophrenics can be very convincing, Detective. She pulled a file from her briefcase. I have 15 years of medical records documenting Thomas's condition. Prescriptions for antipsychotics, therapy notes detailing his delusions of grandeur. He believes he's a serial killer, but it's a fantasy, a symptom of his disease. I took the file, flipping through pages of medical documentation that looked depressingly legitimate. Prescriptions from reputable psychiatrists, notes from therapy sessions describing a patient who believed he had special knowledge about death and important work to do. This is convenient, I said. Your brother gets caught, and suddenly there's a paper trail proving he's insane. This documentation has existed for years, Detective. I've been trying to get Thomas committed for treatment for a long time. But he's high functioning. He holds down a job. He maintains relationships. He knows how to appear normal when he needs to. But inside, she paused, and I saw genuine pain cross her face. Inside, he's broken. He has been since we were children. He said, "You died. Meningitis." Another delusion. He's rewritten our childhood in his mind. In his version, I died and he survived. In reality, he nearly died from meningitis when he was 7. The fever damaged his brain. That's when the problem started. I studied her carefully. She was good, very good. If I didn't know about the journals, the laboratory, the victims, I might have believed her. We found his lab, I said, the equipment he used to make the poison, the toxin that killed 4 women. 4? She looked genuinely surprised. There have been 4 murders. At least, he confessed to 17. She closed her eyes briefly. Detective, I don't doubt that there have been murders, but my brother didn't commit them. He's obsessed with a real serial killer, someone he's been researching for years. He thinks he is this killer. He's adopted their methodology, their psychology, but he's not capable of actually doing these things. Then explain the laboratory. Thomas has a chemistry degree. He works with scientific information every day at the library. His delusions incorporate real knowledge. He probably does have chemistry equipment. He probably has created compounds. But creating something in a basement and actually using it to kill people are very different things. Captain Morrison appeared at my elbow. Detective Holloway, a word. He pulled me aside out of Catherine's earshot. The DA wants to see all the evidence before deciding whether to charge. With a potential insanity defense this well-documented way, they want to be sure we have our ducks in a row. We have his confession, which his lawyer is going to tear apart. We need physical evidence directly linking him to the victims, something undeniable. That's when I realized the problem. We had journals, but journals could be fantasy. We had laboratory equipment, but that only proved he could make poison. Not that he had used it. We had his presence near Melissa Thorne's house, but we'd stopped him before he'd actually done anything. For 17 murders, we had surprisingly little physical evidence. The puncture marks, I said, the injection sites on the victims, we can compare them to the needles we found in his apartment. Already being done. But the marks are so small, and it's been weeks since the first murders. The ME isn't confident she can make a definitive match. I looked back at Catherine, who was now on her phone, probably calling in more legal reinforcement. She's protecting him. She knows what he is. Maybe. Or maybe he really is just a delusional man with an elaborate fantasy life and we're chasing our tails. No. I was certain. I'd looked into Thomas Werner Erickson's eyes. I'd heard the way he talked about his victims. That wasn't delusion, that was pride. He's guilty and I'm going to prove it. Over the next 72 hours, I barely slept. I went through every piece of evidence we'd collected, looking for the one thing that would break the case wide open. I reread the journals, searching for details that could be verified. I examined the laboratory equipment, hoping for traces of victim DNA. I interviewed everyone who'd ever known Thomas Werner Erickson, looking for witnesses who'd seen him near the crime scenes. But Catherine had done her job well. For every piece of evidence I found, she had an explanation. The journals were therapeutic writing, recommended by his therapist. The laboratory was for personal research into the chemistry of natural toxins, a hobby. The reason he was near Melissa Thorne's house? He'd been following her because he believed she was in danger from the real killer he'd been tracking. It was maddening. I knew he was guilty, but knowing and proving are two different things. Then on the 4th day after his arrest, something unexpected happened. One of the officers going through Erickson's apartment found a loose floorboard in his bedroom closet. Under it was a box. Inside the box were 17 driver's licenses, one for each victim. But Catherine Erickson still wasn't finished fighting. "They're not trophies," she insisted when I showed them to her. "They're talismans. Thomas believes he's protecting these women by keeping a part of them close. In his delusional state, he thinks possessing their licenses gives him some kind of spiritual connection that keeps them safe." Safe from what? They're already dead. In this world, yes. But Thomas's delusions include beliefs about an afterlife, about spiritual guardianship. Detective, I know this looks damning. I know it seems impossible that someone could be this elaborate in their fantasies without acting on them. But that's the nature of his particular illness. He's created an entire mythology around himself. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked the question that had been bothering me since she'd appeared. Why? Why are you protecting him? If he's sick, if he's dangerous, why not just let him be convicted? He'd end up in a psychiatric facility either way. For the first time, Catherine's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair. Because it's my fault, she whispered. I sat across from Catherine as her carefully constructed defenses crumbled. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The crack in the armor that would reveal the truth. What do you mean it's your fault? I asked gently. When Thomas was 7, he did almost die from meningitis. Our parents, they weren't good people, Detective. They were religious zealots who believed in faith healing over medicine. By the time they finally took Thomas to a hospital, he'd been sick for days. The infection had already damaged his brain. She wiped at her eyes angrily, as if furious at herself for crying. I was older. I was 12. I knew he needed help, and I didn't call for it myself. I obeyed our parents. I prayed when I should have picked up the phone. And when Thomas survived but changed, when he became someone different, someone wrong, I knew it was because I hadn't acted. You were a child. I was old enough to know better, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to make up for it. I became a lawyer. I got him into treatment programs. I monitored his medication. I thought I was helping him manage his illness. But if he really did kill these women, she looked up at me, devastated. Then I failed. Again. I saw it then, the real reason she was fighting so hard, not to protect Thomas, but to protect herself from the knowledge that her brother was a monster, and she'd enabled him. The medical records, I said, they're real, aren't they? Yes. Thomas has been diagnosed with several mental health conditions over the years. He does take medication, but she took a shaky breath. I don't think he's been taking it. Not for a long time. And I didn't notice because I didn't want to notice. It was easier to believe he was managing his symptoms than to confront the possibility that he'd stopped trying. When did you last see him take his medication? I don't know. Months? A year? He lives alone. He tells me he's taking it. I believe him because... She laughed bitterly. Because I need to believe him. Catherine. I leaned forward. I need you to help me. Not as his lawyer, but as someone who wants justice for his victims. Can you do that? She was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded. What do you need? What I needed was Thomas Werner Erickson's complete collection. If he'd kept driver's licenses, there had to be more. Serial killers don't just take one trophy. They're collectors by nature. And their collections grow over time. Catherine gave me permission to search a storage unit that Thomas rented under her name. She'd never been inside. He'd told her he used it for book storage, overflow from his apartment. I should have questioned that, she said as we drove there together. He works in a library. Why would he need to store books? But I didn't ask because I didn't want to know the answer. We arrived at the storage facility with a full forensics team. Catherine unlocked the unit with trembling hands, and when we rolled up the door, I understood why Thomas had been so willing to confess everything. He wanted his work to be seen. He needed someone to understand what he'd accomplished. The storage unit was a shrine. Photographs covered every wall, not just of his 17 confirmed victims, but of dozens more women. Some photos were taken from a distance, surveillance shots. Others were up close, intimate, terrifying in their implications. In the center of the unit was a filing cabinet. Inside were more journals, these ones going back decades. Thomas had been killing far longer than even he'd initially told me. And in the back, on a shelf, were boxes, 17 of them, each labeled with a name. Inside each box were items belonging to the victims: jewelry, photographs, locks of hair. Personal effects that families had thought lost or misplaced. Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the walls of photographs. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what has he done?" I called for more backup, more evidence teams. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was an archive of evil spanning more than 2 decades. As forensics began documenting everything, I noticed something odd about the photographs. Not all of them were of women. There were men too. Children. Entire families. "What is this?" I asked, pointing to a photo of a family of 4. Mother, father, 2 kids, picnicking in a park. One of the forensics techs pulled up a database on his tablet, running facial recognition. "The woman is Jennifer Holloway, your 3rd victim. And the others? Her family. Husband Marcus Holloway, son Daniel, and daughter Sophie." He paused, his face going pale. "They died in a house fire 6 months after Jennifer's death. Arson, but the perpetrator was never caught." My blood ran cold. "Check the other photos, all of them." What we discovered over the next several hours fundamentally changed our understanding of what Thomas Werner Erickson was. He wasn't just a serial killer. He was something worse. Of his 17 confirmed victims, 14 of them had family members who died within a year of the original murder. House fires, car accidents, unexplained illnesses, deaths that had been investigated but never solved. Thomas hadn't just been killing the women who read about true crime. He'd been systematically eliminating their entire families. The final count, when we finished documenting everything, was 63 victims. 63 lives, ended by one man over 23 years. And most of the world had never heard his name. Catherine collapsed when we told her the final number, literally fell to her knees in the parking lot outside the storage unit. I knelt beside her, not sure what to say or do. "How?" she asked. "How did I not see this? How did I live my entire life next to this and not know?" "Because he was good at hiding," I told her. "Because he understood how to appear normal. This isn't your fault." "Isn't it? I gave him credibility. I told the world he was just a sick man who needed help. How many people died because I convinced everyone my brother was harmless?" It was a question I couldn't answer. Because in a way, she was right. Thomas Werner Erickson had been able to operate for 23 years, partly because he had a devoted sister who provided him with cover, who explained away his eccentricities, who made him seem sympathetic rather than suspicious. But Catherine was also a victim in her own way, manipulated and used by someone she loved, someone she'd spent her life trying to save. "Help me now," I said. "Help me make sure he never hurts anyone else. Help me get justice for those 63 people." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What do you need me to do?" "Tell me everything. Every conversation you've had with him about his delusions. Every time he mentioned death or killing or any of these victims. everything. Over the next several hours, Catherine told me about a lifetime of warning signs she'd ignored or explained away. Thomas's fascination with obituaries, his habit of attending funerals for people he didn't know, the way he talked about death with a clinical detachment that she'd attributed to his illness rather than his nature. He asked me once, she said, what I thought it would feel like to die. Not in a suicidal way, but curious, like he was asking about a place he wanted to visit. I told him it was his disease talking, that he needed to focus on living, not dying. But he just smiled and said, "You're right, of course. Life is what matters." And I believed him. When was this? 2 years ago, right before... She pulled out her phone, checking something. Right before Maria Santos died. She was his 4th victim overall, but only his 2nd in Portland. I wrote down everything she told me, building a timeline of Thomas's crimes that spanned back to 1996. Each piece of information Catherine provided filled in gaps, connected dots, turned suspicions into certainties. By the time we finished, it was 3 a.m. Catherine looked exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of everything she'd learned. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build a case that can't be broken, and we make sure your brother never sees freedom again." They gave me a week off after we discovered the full extent of Erickson's crimes. "Take some time," Captain Morrison said. "Process this, see a therapist, do whatever you need to do." But I couldn't rest, because there was one question that kept me awake at night. Why families? I went back to the interrogation room. Catherine had withdrawn as his lawyer, devastated by what we'd found. Thomas now sat across from me with a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "The families," I said without preamble. "Why did you kill them too?" Thomas smiled, and I saw genuine pleasure in his expression. "You found my collection." "Answer the question." "Because the experiment wasn't complete with just one death, Detective. I needed to observe the ripple effects. When you drop a stone in water, you don't just study the stone, you study the waves. They were people, children. They were variables. When Jennifer Holloway died, how did her husband Marcus grieve? How did the children cope with losing their mother? I watched them. I documented their pain. And then, when enough time had passed, I removed them too, to see if death became easier for them, knowing they'd be reunited with her. To observe if their final moments held anticipation rather than fear. I had to leave the room. I actually had to walk out because I felt physically ill. In the hallway, I found Catherine waiting. She'd been there every day since we discovered the storage unit. Not as his lawyer, but as the family's advocate, ensuring that every victim was properly identified and their loved ones notified. "How do you share genetics with that?" I asked her. "I don't know." She looked as haunted as I felt. The Thomas I knew as a child, before the meningitis, he was kind, gentle. He cried when our cat died, after he got sick, after the fever. It was like someone else came back. Someone who looked like my brother, but wasn't. Do you believe that? That he was fundamentally changed by the illness? I want to believe it, Walpole, because the alternative, that this capacity for evil was always in him, just waiting to be expressed, that means it might be in me too. We're from the same gene pool, Detective. We had the same parents, the same upbringing. If he became a monster, what does that make me? I understood her fear. I'd been having similar thoughts about myself. I'd spent so much time inside Erickson's mind trying to understand his motivations. that sometimes I worried I understood too well. "You're nothing like him," I told her. "You've spent your life trying to help people. That counts." "Does it?" "I helped him most of all. I gave him cover, credibility, a respectable veneer. How many people died because I convinced the world my brother was just a harmless eccentric with a mental illness?" It was a question without a good answer. But it made me think about something else, something I needed the viewers to consider. When you hear about a tragedy, when you read about an unexplained death or an unfortunate accident, do you ever wonder if there's more to the story? Do you ever question whether someone got away with murder? Because Thomas Werner Erickson did again and again for more than 2 decades. How many other killers do you think are out there right now, hiding in plain sight? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think, because this matters. Your awareness matters. Your willingness to question the official story matters. The trial began 3 months later. The prosecution had more evidence than any case I'd ever worked. The journals, the laboratory, the trophies, the storage unit shrine, Thomas Werner Erickson's own detailed confessions. It should have been straightforward. But Catherine had been right about one thing. Thomas was very, very good at appearing sympathetic. On the stand, he was soft-spoken and remorseful. He cried when they showed photographs of the victims. He talked about hearing voices, about compulsions he couldn't control, about the terror of realizing what he'd done during his clear moments. His new legal team, a group of high-powered defense attorneys who'd taken the case pro bono for the publicity, painted him as a tragic figure, a man whose childhood illness had created a monster he couldn't control. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about brain damage from meningitis, about how it could cause personality changes and violent impulses. I watched families of the victims sitting in the gallery, some crying, some stone-faced with rage. They deserved better than watching this performance. When it was my turn to testify, I made sure to read excerpts from the journals. Not the sanitized versions the defense wanted to present, but the real ones. The entries where Erickson described his victims' final moments with scientific detachment and aesthetic appreciation, where he rated their deaths on various criteria, where he expressed not remorse, but pride. Does this sound like a man who couldn't control himself? I asked the jury. Or does it sound like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and enjoyed every moment? I read Jennifer Holloway's entry. How he'd watched her for 3 months. How he'd learned her schedule, her habits, her fears. How he'd waited until her husband was out of town on business before making his move. How he'd stood over her bed and watched the toxin take effect, timing it with a stopwatch, documenting every second of her death. And then I read the entries about her family, how he'd attended Jennifer's funeral and observed Marcus's grief, how he'd watched the children at the playground, noting how their behavior changed in the weeks after their mother's death, how he'd planned the house fire for exactly 6 months later, long enough for them to begin healing, short enough that Jennifer's memory would still be fresh. He wanted them to think of her as they died, I told the jury. He wanted their last thoughts to be of reunion, because to him that was data, that was information he could use to understand the psychology of death. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even the defense attorneys had nothing to say. The prosecution also called Catherine to testify. She told the truth about everything. The faked medical records she'd helped create, her enabling behavior, her brother's true nature. "He's not insane," she said firmly, her voice breaking. "He's evil." And I was too blind to see it. I was too desperate to save him, to realize he didn't want to be saved. He wanted to kill. He chose to kill. And I gave him the cover he needed to do it for 23 years. She looked directly at the families in the gallery. "I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring your loved ones back. But I need you to know that if I could trade places with any of them, I would. If my death could undo even one of his murders, I'd die right now gladly." The judge had to call a recess because half the gallery was sobbing. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty on all counts. 63 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life without possibility of parole. 63 consecutive sentences. So that even if you live to be 1,000 years old, the judge said, you will never draw another breath as a free man. Thomas Werner Erickson showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He simply sat there, hands folded, that same calm expression on his face that I'd seen the night we arrested him. But as they led him out of the courtroom, he turned and looked at me one last time, and he smiled. Not a smile of defeat or resignation, a smile of satisfaction. Because he'd gotten what he wanted all along, recognition. His work had been seen, documented, studied. He would be remembered. And that realization haunted me more than anything else about the case. 3 years have passed since Thomas Werner Erickson's conviction. In that time, I've worked 17 other homicide cases, helped put away 12 killers, and saved lives I'll never know about by getting dangerous people off the streets. But I still think about Erickson every day. He writes to me sometimes from the maximum security psychiatric facility where he's housed. Long letters about philosophy, about the nature of evil, about whether free will exists or if we're all just responding to biological imperatives we don't understand. I don't write back. But I read every letter because I'm still trying to understand. Not to excuse, not to forgive, but to learn. Because the world has more monsters in it than we want to believe. And understanding how they think is the only way to stop them. The letters are always the same in one way. He never expresses remorse, never apologizes, never acknowledges that what he did was wrong. Instead, he writes about his research as if it were legitimate science, as if 63 murders were just data points in a grand experiment. In his last letter, he wrote, "Detective Holloway, do you ever wonder if our roles could have been reversed? If circumstances had been slightly different? If I had chosen law enforcement and you had chosen science, would you be where I am and I where you are? We're both driven by the same fundamental curiosity about death. The only difference is the methods we use to satisfy it. I burned that letter. I've kept all the others, filed away as evidence of his continuing pathology. But that one I burned because he was wrong. We're not the same. Curiosity about death is human. Using that curiosity to justify murder is monstrous, and refusing to see the difference is exactly what makes someone like Thomas Werner Erickson so dangerous. Catherine Erickson left the law. Last I heard, she was working with victim advocacy groups, using her experience to help families navigate the legal system after violent crimes. She sends me a card every Christmas, always with the same message. Thank you for seeing the truth when I couldn't. I saw her last month at a victims' rights conference. She looked different, older, sadder, but also somehow more at peace. I'm writing a book, she told me, about warning signs, about how family members can recognize when someone they love is dangerous. I figure if I can save even one person from making my mistakes, it's worth it. That's good, I said. That's really good. I also wanted to tell you something. She hesitated, then continued. I visited Thomas last week. First time since the trial. Why? I needed to ask him something. I needed to know if there was ever a moment, any moment in the last 23 years, when he considered stopping. When he thought about the people he was hurting and chose to walk away. What did he say? He said no. He said once he started, the only thing he regretted was that human lifespan is so limited, that he wished he could live for centuries so he could expand his research. She wiped at her eyes, and then he asked me if I wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. He offered to describe it in detail, like he was offering to share a recipe. I'm sorry, don't be. It helped, actually, hearing him say that, because it made me realize that the brother I loved died a long time ago. Maybe from the meningitis, maybe he never existed at all. But the thing wearing his face isn't him. It's something else. And I can mourn the brother I lost without feeling guilty about wanting the monster punished. I understood what she meant. Grief and justice aren't mutually exclusive. You can mourn what someone was while demanding accountability for what they became. The families of the 63 victims received some measure of closure, though I know closure is a myth we tell ourselves. You don't close the wound of losing someone you love to violence. You just learn to live with the scar. But here's what I want you to understand. What I need you to hear. We won. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in time to save those 63 people, but we won. Thomas Werner Erickson will die in prison. He'll never kill again. He'll never feel sunlight without bars between him and the sky. He'll never know freedom or joy or the simple pleasures of an unmonitored life. And more importantly, the victims are remembered. Every single one of them, their names, their faces, their stories, they're not lost, they're not forgotten, they matter. Jennifer Holloway was a high school teacher who stayed late every Tuesday to tutor students who were struggling. She believed every kid deserved a chance to succeed, and she gave that chance freely to anyone who asked. Maria Santos volunteered at a free clinic on weekends, using her nursing skills to help people who couldn't afford health care. She saved lives on her own time, asking nothing in return. Rebecca Chen was 3 months away from launching a nonprofit to teach coding to underprivileged kids. She wanted to open doors for children who looked like her, who came from the same immigrant background, who needed to see that success was possible. Linda Mercer had personally recommended books to thousands of library patrons over her career, matching each person with the perfect story. She believed reading could change lives, and she dedicated her life to proving it. Marcus Holloway was a software engineer who coached Little League on weekends. Daniel Holloway was 8 years old and wanted to be an astronaut. Sophie Holloway was 6 and loved to draw pictures of butterflies. Every single victim had a life, had dreams, had people who loved them. They were teachers and nurses and engineers and children and parents and friends. They mattered. They still matter. And the ripple effects of their lives, the students Jennifer taught, the patients Maria treated, the kids Rebecca inspired, the readers Linda helped, those ripples continue. Death ended their lives, but not their impact. That's what monsters like Erikson can never understand. They think they're studying death, but they don't understand life. They don't comprehend that every person they kill leaves behind a web of connections, of love, of meaning that continues long after the body is gone. I visit the memorial sometimes. The city erected it in the park where Jennifer Holloway used to take her kids before Erikson killed them all. 63 plaques, each bearing a name and a photograph. People leave flowers there, notes, toys for the children. Standing there reading those names, I'm reminded why I do this job. Not for the thrill of the chase or the satisfaction of solving puzzles, but for them, for the people who can't speak for themselves anymore. Last week, I got a letter from Sophie Holloway's best friend. She's 23 now, a teacher herself, inspired by Jennifer Holloway's dedication to education. She named her daughter Sophie after the friend who never got to grow up. I wanted to thank you, she wrote, for making sure they weren't just forgotten, for fighting for them. Every time I teach a lesson, every time I help a struggling student, I think about Mrs. Holloway. I think about the Sophie who should have been here beside me, teaching her own students. I make sure their legacy continues. I keep that letter on my desk. When I'm working a new case, when I'm tired and frustrated and the evidence isn't cooperating, I look at it and remember why persistence matters. Why every victim deserves someone who won't give up on finding the truth. 3 weeks ago, the department assigned me a new partner. Young detective, first year in homicide, full of energy and idealism. She reminds me of myself before Erikson. We were driving to a crime scene when she asked me, "Does it get easier? Seeing the worst of what people do to each other?" I thought about lying, about giving her some comforting platitude, but she deserved the truth. "No," I told her, "it never gets easier. The day it gets easier is the day you need to quit, because it means you've stopped seeing victims as people. Then how do you keep going? You remember that for every monster out there, there are 1,000 good people. For every Thomas Werner Erikson, there are teachers and nurses and software developers and librarians trying to make the world better. The monsters are the exception, not the rule. And you remember that stopping one monster means dozens or hundreds of people get to keep living. That's worth the nightmares." You really believe that? I have to, otherwise what's the point? We worked that case together, my new partner and I, a domestic homicide, tragic but straightforward. The husband confessed within hours. We got justice for the victim, a woman named Laura Chen, who'd been trying to leave an abusive relationship. Small victories. They matter too. Tonight, I'll go home to my apartment. I'll feed my cat. Yes, I got a cat because after Erikson, I needed something to care for that wasn't broken or dead. I'll pour a glass of wine. And I'll sleep, knowing that Thomas Werner Erikson is in a cell and I'm free. He took 63 lives, but he didn't take mine. He didn't break my faith in humanity. He didn't win. And that, in the end, is what I want you to take from this story. Evil exists. It's real and it's out there. And sometimes it wears a friendly face and works at your local library. Sometimes it has a sister who loves it and doctors who try to help it and a whole system of people who want to believe it can be fixed. But evil doesn't win. Not ultimately. Not if good people refuse to look away. Thomas Werner Erikson is the most evil serial killer you've never heard about. But now you have heard about him, and more importantly, you've heard about his victims. You know their names, their stories, their worth. Don't let them be forgotten. Share this video. Tell their stories. When you talk about this case, spend more time on who they were than on who he was. Because that's how we truly defeat monsters. Not by destroying them, but by ensuring they fail in their ultimate goal. Erikson wanted to be famous. He wanted his work to be recognized and studied. But instead of making him famous, let's make his victims unforgettable. And if you take nothing else from this, take this. Pay attention to the people around you, the quiet ones, the helpful ones, the ones who seem just a little too interested in tragedy. Because monsters don't announce themselves. They hide in plain sight, but they can be found. They can be stopped. They can be defeated. I know, because I did it. My name is Detective Sarah Holloway, and this was the case that changed everything I thought I knew about evil, but it also taught me everything I needed to know about good. The human capacity for cruelty is real, but so is the human capacity for courage, for justice, for refusing to give up on the dead. 63 people died, but their stories don't end with their deaths. They live on in the people they touched, the lives they changed, the world they tried to make better. And Thomas Werner Erikson? He'll die alone in a cell, forgotten by everyone except the detectives who study serial killers and the families who still grieve. That's justice, that's victory, that's how good defeats evil. We won. Remember that, we won.